So I'm Erik Goodwyn. I'm a psychiatrist, practicing psychiatrist, 20 years or so now. I'm also a Jungian lecturer, and I've written quite a bit on Jungian psychology and anthropology, dreams, dream analysis, philosophy of mind, all kinds of stuff like that. Also adjunct professor in the University of Louisville. I've lectured at the Jung Institute in Zurich and a couple of the Jungian institutes here in the States as well.
Erik, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Two questions that I like to ask everybody at the beginning of the episode, and we're going to talk about grief and dreams and near death, and I'm very excited about the conversation. But I'm always curious what my guests' relationships are with death. Do you think about it a lot? Is it something you worry about? What would you consider your relationship with death like right now?
Oh, I've pondered death ever since as long as I can remember. It's always been one of those things that's on my mind, the mystery of mortality and life after death. And I've been through several different phases where I had different approaches to the question. Yeah, it's always been something that's there. And then more recently, in some of my academic writing, I've tackled the subject of how do different cultures handle death. In Western industrialized nations, we've traded material technology for ritual technology, like the ritual mechanisms that many indigenous people around the world have to help facilitate the grieving process are far more nuanced and I think sophisticated than what we do now for various sundry reasons. So that also fascinated me too, because I think it impacts mental health significantly. We live in a culture that's so hyper individualized and, community and, affiliation and tribal affiliation, that kind of thing has broken down significantly. And that has led, I think, people to view themselves as isolated individuals to the point where death becomes insurmountably terrifying. And so we've got a whole lot of deathophobia. Some authors out there call it thanatophobia, for that reason. The way that we handle death and avoid it and pretend like it doesn't exist and try to live forever and look like, we're eternally young, all feeds into that.
I mean, I've talked to people on this podcast who have told me they're going to live forever, that like they truly believe it. Or there's cryogenics. We've done a lot of that. I'm in Arizona. In Scottsdale, there's a massive cryogenics lab, happening out here. And then, like the plastic surgery, I don't think people realize when you see people that get like these surgeries or these like lip injection, all this kind of Botox stuff. I think everyone looks at it from a very basic standpoint in like, oh, well, they just want to look young, obviously, but look better, look like the people on the magazine, on TV, whatever. But I think it really does boil down to it's just a fear of dying more than anything. And I don't even, maybe they might not even realize it, but that's essentially what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's important is to recognize where that fear is coming from. And I guess, again, I often will point back to the significant loneliness problem that we have and the feelings of isolation and the significant deterioration of community affiliation has led us to this fear of death, because the way that we manage death is to recognize that we're part of a greater whole, so that something of us lives on through those, interconnections. That's how it's been done since time immemorial, regardless of one's, religious beliefs. We live on through the affiliations that we have, but as that breaks down, it all becomes this sort of existential nightmare of it's just me in the universe.
Yeah.
Well, no wonder it's so terrifying, and we go through such labyrinthine, mechanisms to, avoid that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's so true. It's really interesting. I mean, and it's sort of something you mentioned again before we got started here. which I'd love to talk about as well, is like the ritual of it, right? I think that the ritual is important. It's a big part of grieving, but I also think it's so important because it gives you like a feeling of community, right? And this is what you're talking about with like this loneliness. I can only speak for myself. I feel like as I've gotten older, I've very much been seeking out community more than anything in my life.
Yeah.
And I do think a big part of it is getting older. And obviously, your life changes as you get older. People move, you lose friendships, things change. And then another aspect is death. And again, just speaking for myself, you start thinking about when you die, who's going to be there? Are you going to be alone? And I think that ritual is such an important part of that, and it's something that's like non-existent almost in America, at least. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. I really do feel like, and it seems like you agree that it's basically non-existent here. Where did the ritual go?
It's a fairly complicated question in terms of like what are the historical precedents and all that. I think it's been a slow erosion. It has to do a lot with economic factors. We have like the post-Enlightenment, post-Protestant society, and the global market economy, all that kind of thing has fed into this idea that those sorts of things are relatively disposable. You can really see this if you look at the history of Japan and how they transitioned into a more modern industrialized society very quickly in the 19th and 20th centuries from what they were doing before, which is essentially kind of a feudal setup. And so I've read some interesting works by anthropologists studying Japan, natives of Japan as well, where they look at how the rituals of death changed so rapidly in urbanized areas. And it went from all of the stuff that you need to do for the deceased becoming more of a like an optional sort of thing that you do basically just for the family. And it kind of removed all of the spiritual teeth out of it, which when you do that, of course, people are just going to not do it anymore. So, yeah. And I think it's a part of getting older. I remember thinking about death as a kid. It's just sort of an idea, and this, abstract kind of sense is still compelling and, grapple with it. But now that I'm in my 50s, it's a whole lot more real because I can look at people that I've known for many years and they look a hell of a lot different than they did when I knew them when they were kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, I mean, you can't pretend like that's not a thing. And,
Sure.
You look at myself and pictures and all that, and I have grandchildren as well. And I remember what my kids were like as babies, and now that they're in their 30s. So that kind of, a thing that's in your face, so like it really just shows you.
Yeah.
It's mortality is right in your face. So you really got to think about it. But, you talk about the ritual aspects. Let me go. I've got one of my older papers here where I talk about that. I'll go through some things that I found. I did a cross-cultural survey of death rituals around the world and just trying to find what are the common elements that you see typically. And then we can compare those to what we do.
Sure.
One of the things that they do is they provide a cultural container for the emotionality of grief. They'll put it firmly into a culturally defined context. They often will force acceptance of the deceased through an intense, extended, close contact between the deceased and the bereaved. So you see that in a lot of societies where there's like either an overnight vigil or sometimes it lasts for several days where the deceased basically is just there dead and the closest relatives continue to take care of the deceased as if they were still alive. That's just part of the rituals that they've done. Now, I would say the psychological effect of that is to force acceptance of the fact that they're dead. Because like you say, it's in your face. It's right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of times they will have an idea that the deceased is in a vulnerable state and the bereaved have to do all kinds of different ritual things to help protect them from evil spirits or whatever the explanation is. You'll have a collection of important tasks to do for the bereaved to accomplish in order to transition them to, the paradise beyond. So they're in this vulnerable state, and that's something that you see constantly around the world. Also, these rituals help to reframe the relationship between the bereaved and the deceased, going from not I have a relationship with someone who's alive to I have a relationship with somebody who's gone. It's not that. It's my relationship is still there. It's now just different, which is very important. And it also employs all sorts of methods to physically enact the grief. Sometimes it's like they'll even deliberately tell you to channel all of your rage and your grief into a movement, whether it's like the slamming down of a sacred staff or, something like that. They usually will have ways that you can embody that. And then the eighth one is that they employ methods to integrate the death into a larger coherent narrative that's compatible with the surrounding belief system. So they'll say that the person has gone down the sacred river to the land of wherever it is, in that position after all of the stuff has been done, then they are in a new relationship with the deceased, or with the bereaved rather, and that relationship continues, and they can even provide blessings and benefits from beyond. We don't do hardly any of that stuff.
I was just thinking, like, none of this is happening over here.
No, none of this stuff is. We're very, very ritually impoverished, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And that's been a slow erosion of this process. Anybody who is in the like funeral industry will take about this too. And it's just so bizarre. Like we've gone from almost every society in existence, the people will handle their own dead and manage that whole process themselves, to basically handing it over to specialists. And we don't really see much of it. And so it doesn't register. It's not real. It doesn't feel real. I've even seen people who choose not to even do a funeral.
Yeah.
It just goes directly to burial. I'm like, that's kind of bonkers. Like, it seems like you're just asking for complicated grief in that situation. Because that's what I think these rituals have been they have evolved to do, is to mitigate complicated grief.
I never really thought about it in the sense of like somebody not wanting to have a funeral for themselves. Like they're saying, when I pass away, I don't want there to be a funeral. Mm-hmm. It's really only affecting the people who are going to be actively grieving. They're dead, but we do have this sense of it's their, this is their choice, right? They should be allowed to say if they have a funeral or not, but should they be allowed to say that?
Well,
I don't know.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think that, yes, people should be allowed to do what they want, but as long as they know what they're doing. Like, if you know what I'm saying? Like, if I were to decide that now, knowing what I know about the function of funeral rituals, I wouldn't do that to my loved ones.
Sure.
Right? Because I don't want them to suffer. I want them to be okay with me passing on. So I wouldn't do that, And I think that's what the problem is that we're not really seeing what the point of it is. And we've had this materialist paradigm that's been so popular for so long that it's very dismissive. And even if you can't believe in the life after death or any of that stuff, you can still see the psychological purpose of some of this stuff and how important it is to the human, condition.
Yeah. And I think a big part of it is we're not having these conversations, so people don't think about the consequences of not having a funeral.
That's why podcasts like yours are really important. They're necessary. So like whatever it is that, the divine calling that made you want to do this.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I absolutely agree. And the calling of this podcast was completely selfish in the fact that the amount of anxiety I had about death was basically forcing me to speak about it, and was able to create an outlet for it. I'm very lucky that and then it's just turned into this thing now that I would have never imagined. But yeah, 100% agree. I loved how you said how they would have people enact their grief, slamming their fist or like. I feel like I want to just start shaking people and tell them that's such an incredible thing to think about, to tell people to do, because I do think a lot of people just sit in their grief, and I think if you told them that no, you could like turn it into something, I think that there's like a lot of power in that.
Oh, absolutely. And all you really have to do is you don't have to dive into the academic stuff about it unless you want to.
Yeah.
But you don't even have to do that. All you have to do is like Google, First Nations funeral rites, or of the Dene or the Tlingit or of the Indonesian or African or whatever it is, and you'll find all kinds of ways in which people manage death and deal with the dying. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. And it's just, and the more you study it, the more you're like, man, we don't do squat. I mean, we're just so bereft of any sort of symbolic enactment, or, it's sad.
Yeah, I think most people feel completely powerless after they lose someone and really start grieving, unless they have like a really good group of people around them. Again, with the loneliness, if you lose someone, and maybe that was one of like if you're lucky, a handful of people that were in your life, and you lose someone like that, I think that, these rituals is really going to be the only thing that could kind of get you out of that grief that you're dealing with, especially in the beginning,
Yeah, definitely. The process of complicated grief is, the idea is to get you from that to integrated grief. So integrated grief is where you still feel an occasional pang of missing them and whatnot, but it doesn't dominate your life. One of the elements of these rituals that I've noticed particularly is the idea that you need to do these various things for the deceased to protect them, to facilitate their transition to the other world, because they're in this kind of liminal state right after they die, especially if they die from some kind of surprising or violent means like murder or bolts of lightning or death in childbirth or suicide, things like that. Those call for additional ritual mechanisms in all the cultures I've looked at. But that idea that I need to do A, B, and C for them, regardless of whether you believe it or not, from a psychological point of view, it helps me get out of my head. It helps me think, okay, this isn't just about me. That person, I mean, they're dead, right? That really sucks. At least I'm still alive,
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, though, it allows you to do something physical with the grief.
Yeah.
And I'm helping them. What surprised me too was there's a number of different belief systems that curtail excessive grieving. Like my favorite example is the Northern Cheyenne, where you get 3 days and you can cry all you want. Yeah. Then you're done, or else the ancestors will come back and they'll give you something to cry about. The reason is because all of that excessive weeping and wailing prevents their transition to the land of sweet medicine.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Right. So now how can you argue with that? Right. You can't.
Yeah. You love them.
You don't want that to happen. And so you're going to get it all out of your system. And then hopefully, you'll be able to say, okay, well, I'm helping them by not diving into that feeling more. There's other ways in which that's been handled. Some of them are really wild, like the Warramunga of Australia, where after a death, they go into this wild frenzy, like the whole tribe. Durkheim described this. And I mean, sometimes it's so violent that they add to the death count. But then slowly, and people get injured. It's crazy. It's bonkers. But then after all of that initial outburst, it slowly morphs into this thing where everyone is like swaying and singing, and it's intense to read about. I've never seen it.
Yeah.
But I can only imagine how powerful that is and how that can shift the psyche permanently as a result.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like the extreme version of enacting your grief, but...
Oh, no, that's not the most extreme. The most extreme I've read is the Ilongot of Southeast Asia.
Okay.
Their tribe, if someone dies, then the only way to, or at least one of the best ways to eliminate the grief is to go across the mountain and kill a rival tribe, chop their head off, and, you basically deal with your grief by throwing the severed head.
Oh, wow.
In a sacred manner.
So it's just it sounds like it's just a circle of people chopping each other's heads off until there's no one left.
I guess, yeah.
That's one way of grieving, I guess. Not recommended on this podcast, but you do what you got to do, I guess.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but the important thing about that is to recognize the rage that arises from grief.
Yeah.
It's often not recognized how angry that makes us.
Yeah.
And that's just completely normal. And some cultures will, emphasize it and, light the fire under it, like the Ilongot. But I don't think pretending like it isn't there is always the greatest idea either.
No. Yeah. Probably the worst idea.
Probably the worst. Yeah.
So let's get into the subconscious grief. We discussed a little bit. Obviously, I want to talk about dreams and how grief affects our dreams and our subconscious. And if you could give like a little bit of a background on what you've studied and what you sort of learned about dreaming. And then I'd love to really get into, the grief aspect of dreaming. And then if we have a little bit of time, I definitely want to discuss a little bit of near-death
Yeah.
experience.
Okay. So normally dreaming is about organizing myself. We dream every night as a way to try to bring together memory consolidation, identity formation, future planning, and emotional regulation. Those are the four main functions of dreaming. And I think that's most of the time what's going on. But it seems like during a time of grieving, obviously that process will be focused on the grief because it's the major emotional challenge of the moment. And now, how does that manifest? Well, what I've seen in treating people over the years is that it's very common to have a dream of the person who just passed on.
Sure.
And it's not a dream where they're still alive and you're like back there with them. That's a different kind of dream. These particular ones are where both you and the deceased are aware that they are dead and you're having a conversation about that. That's what's more common in this situation. Also, that's something that's very common is for uncanny things to happen around, particularly if someone really close to you. Now, is this some kind of supernatural thing? I don't know, but it is common anyway, just so people don't think that they're going bonkers,
Yeah.
But I've had lots of people tell me when I allow them the space to talk about it and they are not afraid of me poo-pooing it or dismissing it. They'll say, yeah, sometimes they'll wake up and they'll feel an intense presence of the person who's gone. Things will be moved around in their house, all that kind of thing. So what I would do with that is I try to go with it. I'll say, okay, well, what do you think they want? What do you think that they need from you? And I'm just referring back to those ritual elements that we don't do and say, well, what can you do for them?
Yeah.
And a lot of times that helps to, resolve whatever it is, if there's really a ghost or whatever doing that then it still solves the problem. Right.
To me, someone who's never studied dreams and is basically on the polar opposite level of your insight into this, I would assume this is your brain trying in some way to fix the grief, to help you deal with the grief. I think dreams are all over the place. I mean, sometimes you're flying through the air, sometimes you're standing in front of your, high school classroom in your underwear. Like, it's just dreams are just so all over the place. The fact that obviously grief is such a strong emotion that you're having these very specific dreams. I mean, is it just our brain trying to just fix us?
Yes. However, that's not to say that it rules out that there is some kind of supernatural element to this. And I don't even really like the word supernatural.
Okay.
Because it's vague and it depends on what we mean by natural. And there's a whole philosophy behind that. But I would say that if you want to just stick to what we know, scientific wise speaking, and not speculate into the metaphysical.
I want to do both, but you go ahead.
I do too. I like both myself.
Yeah.
But we'll just staying within the scientific paradigm of what we feel like we know anyway, that you could say that those kinds of dreams are essentially the unconscious mind trying to help you manage the grief by doing those things that the rituals do naturally. So the reason why these rituals emerge independently of each other around the globe is because they speak to something universal within us. We all tend to think the same way because we're all the same species. We all have brains that are pretty much organized the same way. And even though there's a lot of variation there, there's also a lot of similarities. One of those is we have a need to continue the relationship on some level, whether it's just if you think if it's only just with an image in your mind or a memory, fine, then that's what you're doing. Is it possible that that image also corresponds to an actual consciousness that's non-physical? Maybe it is. We'll leave that to the parapsychologist to sort out. And I will say that having read quite a bit of parapsychology, they lean pretty heavily on the fact that there probably is something to it.
Yeah.
And it's not just this or just that. But yeah, from a purely psychological point of view, it is the brain attempting to manage the grief and help with that deep cut and that sting by saying, because usually the content tells you the story. Like I'm dreaming about someone who I loved who recently died, and they appear to me in a dream, and I'll tell them, hey, you're dead now. What am I supposed to do now? It's like, it's okay. Usually it's a reassuring message.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's resolving an unresolved conflict of some kind. Like you didn't do this, or you did that, or I forgive you, or that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so the brain is trying to sort that out. Now it could be that the other person's spirit is actually communicating with you. Either way, the end result is going to be the same.
Yeah.
With hopefully, ideally, a resolution.
Yeah, of course. This is your brain trying to help you grieve, and by bringing this person back to you in whatever way it can. I mentioned to you earlier this book called The Grieving Brain, and Mary Frances O'Connor, she's a neuroscientist. She's been on the podcast, and we were talking about studying the brain while it's actively grieving. And I've said this before, but basically she just compares it to like phantom limb theory, right? Where it's like people lose an arm after you're all healed and you're back to normal. A lot of people say they still feel like they could still feel their arm, and that's just their brain solving the problem. So when you lose a person, your brain can't bring the person back. It can't solve the problem.
Right.
And so when we talk about dreams, I'm thinking this is how it decides to solve it. It's like, okay, I can't bring the person back, but I can have them talk to you in a dream. That's a fair compromise, right? So yeah, I guess that's really what it comes down to is it just the brain trying to help you deal with grief, or is it something more than that? And I think that's where the near-death experience stuff comes into play, right?
Yes, that's because that's the big question. Is it all just in your head or not? And the only way to really sort that out is through whatever studies you can do of those experiences in which the image of the deceased somehow gives you information you could not have conjured up on your own. Right. And so the way to look at that are something called Picandarian experiences. I don't know if you've heard of those.
I have not. Please.
Okay.
I would love to.
So near-death experiences all have a very common structure to them, very commonly repeated themes of I have a life review. I encounter people who've died before me. There's the tunnel, there's the light, there's the sense of universal oneness of the universe.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll see angelic beings or gods or goddesses or whatever. And then almost always, of course, it's someone saying you're not finished yet. You have to go back, and then they go back, and then they wake up. And this is something that you see repeated throughout the world. And there's even ancient texts of people writing stuff like this.
Okay.
Pretty interesting. Yeah. And,
yeah.
There's been all kinds of attempts to so-called debunk this, which I think is stupid terminology, but basically trying to explain it in terms of brain physiology. Like there's the tunnel is because the optic chiasm is having less blood flow to it. And all these explanations sound pretty good until you explore them in greater depth, and they kind of break down because there's so many ways in which people have these near-death experiences that don't match up with the so-called physiological parameters that are supposed to go along with it, that they don't really hold together very well. They may find one someday that holds together perfectly. Who knows? But at least for right now, we still kind of have to take it at face value and say, well, okay, maybe there's some reality to this. And the most compelling, I think, evidence of it are what they call these Picandarian experiences, which is a near-death experience in which you encounter someone who you don't know is actually dead. And then when you wake up, someone else comes along and says, well, actually, they recently died, and you just didn't know that. There are quite a few documented cases of these over the last couple of centuries that parapsychologists have picked up, and that's pretty good evidence that something else is going on here. It could be just ESP or something like that, which gets into a whole nother conversation. But but what in the heck is that all about? Maybe the reason is because there actually is some kind of existence beyond death.
Yeah,
that's one obvious explanation. But because of our current, I guess materialistic or reductionistic popular paradigm, people don't like that explanation. But I think, what's funny is in talking about this kind of stuff with people, the most resistant to them seem to be psychologists, not physicists. Well, my background is physics and math, and I remember having all kinds of conversations like this with fellow physicists, and you would think physicists would be super reductive, but the problem is quantum mechanics. When you get into quantum mechanics and relativity, then all of the intuitive ideas go right out the window. And they're like, well, yeah, maybe it's that. And you'll have physicists now talking about quantum consciousness and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. So, yeah, they've already decided that this rigid idea between mind and matter doesn't really work. And that's really the root of it. And I've written on that too. The mind-body problem. All of this really centers on what is the relationship between mind and matter? Because if that's not a physicalist paradigm, like mind emerges primarily and solely from matter. If you believe that, then a lot of this stuff is impossible, in which case you got to throw it out. Whether you accept that or not, it's under the radar. It's an unspoken assumption. But there are other paradigms, and some of them are very well worked out, like panpsychism, for example. David Chalmers has famously made that one a whole lot more in the discussion in philosophy, if you're familiar with his work. But the idea that that mind is really just an elementary part of matter, just like charge and mass. And there's a little bit of psyche in all matter as well. That helps resolve the mind-body problem on a certain level. In which case, okay, now life after death and ESP and all this other wild stuff is possible on some level. And it's not supernatural even. It's fully natural.
Yeah.
Just the way the universe works.
It's just so interesting to think about, in the stories that you hear. There's a show that I rewatched recently called Surviving Death. I don't know if you saw that.
No, I've never.
It's on Netflix. You should definitely check it out.
Okay.
It's a couple of different stories. One is like a reincarnation story, and then there's a few different near deaths. And the first story that they talk about is this near death experience. This woman was kayaking, and she gets flipped over and kind of jammed into a corner, and basically is stuck underwater for almost 30 minutes. She's basically dead for 30 minutes. Eventually, friends come and pull her out, and they're trying to resuscitate her. And eventually, all of these different things, like they're in the middle of nowhere kayaking, and they resuscitate her to a certain point. They throw her in a car. They start driving, and like as they turn a corner, there's just an ambulance there, and there's like all these like crazy parts to it. She survives, and once she's like conscious and kind of back and able to talk about it, she's able to tell them everything that happened. And she basically told them she watched the entire thing happen. She was able to recount all of it, every step of the way. And it's like things like that is where, I mean, that's not seeing relatives or friends that have passed away. Mm-hmm. She was able to explain what had happened while she was clinically dead underwater. And it's like, that's just like a whole nother level of, how is that's not the brain operating?
How is that possible?
Yeah.
I
mean,
well, that's true. I didn't mention that, but that's another element of it too, is the out of body experience.
Yeah.
Where you look like you're floating above.
Yeah.
And all that.
Yeah. There's people that will like be on the operating table and they're like, oh, I watched the whole operation. I remember when you dropped that tool or whatever it was. Yeah. And they're like, how the fuck do you know that?
Yeah. Now, what I think some people will do is try to explain that as that the brain, even though it looks clinically dead, it really isn't. And it's picking up on these sensory cues that then you later put together into a coherent narrative.
Sure.
And that, that's certainly possible. But
yeah,
the other explanation is that there's just consciousness isn't tied to the matter quite as, rigidly as you think it is.
Yeah.
And, that's what's going on.
Yeah. Consciousness is just something that that we're nowhere near, able to understand at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, part of the problem with consciousness is that it has a holistic quality to it that is very resistant to being broken down into pieces, parts.
Yeah.
And even though you've got all these various neurological things that happen in the brain that do all kinds of weird things to consciousness, it's still what Chalmers called the hard problem to explain how buzzing neurons somehow create the experience that we have, right? Yeah. Because, the classic one is the pain neurons, right? Pain neurons firing correlates with the feeling of ouch. right?
Yeah.
But why? Why does it feel like that and not some other way? There's no way to answer that question easily. And piling on more neuroscience on top of that is only just going to generate more correlations. It's not really going to answer the question you want, so that's a whole rabbit hole we could go down, but
Sure.
yeah. But I mean, the bottom line is the relationship to mind and matter. If you don't require yourself to stick to a physicalist paradigm, then these things are not quite so mystifying, and you don't have to go through such gyrations in order to explain them away.
Yeah.
But that does mean that you have to open up ideas to things like that consciousness pervades the universe, or maybe the entire universe is conscious. That's cosmopsychism, which I talk about in some of my videos.
Yeah, I love the idea of like, we're basically just the universe experiencing itself, right? Like it's found a way to create.
Extremely ancient idea, really.
Yeah, I think
around for
it's
millennia.
So there's a story that I read a couple of years ago that I still think about all the time, and it fits into this conversation, I think, and I'm just curious to get your opinion on it. And this sort of goes back to my thought process of wanting to believe that these experiences in near death are real, and it's not just your mind, trying to calm you down or help you through. But I do believe that over time, the brain has obviously evolved in a way where it learns what helps the body while they're actively dying. I don't think that's a crazy theory to have.
No.
But there were doctors, this was a BBC story, I don't have where it happened, but they accidentally recorded the brain activity of an 87-year-old patient at the exact moment he died. Mm-hmm. So he was connected to an EEG when he went into cardiac arrest. And basically in the 30 seconds before and after his heart stopped, his brain showed strong bursts of activity similar to what we see during dreaming, memory recall, or deep meditation. I mean, he died. That wasn't a near-death experience.
That was a death experience.
That was a death experience.
Yeah.
But that seems like pretty solid evidence that our brain, they compared it to what people often describe as, life flashing before your eyes. It was replaying meaningful moments in your life. Mm-hmm. And so when you do see people, and this is why I think the whole theory of seeing somebody in a near-death experience that you didn't know is dead is such a great avenue to go down, because I think in every other instance, seeing your grandma in your near-death experience, I don't think that's so profound. I think it's your brain trying to help you. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to the dreams. I can't bring this person back, so now I'm gonna put them in your mind while you sleep.
Part of this is you have to be careful not to make too many assumptions about neuroscientific findings, because if I imagine a red apple, say, mm-hmm. and if I see a red apple on the table, my brain will light up in a very similar manner. So just because my brain is lighting up as if I'm seeing an apple doesn't mean there isn't an apple there. Just because the brain is shifting into this other mode doesn't necessarily tell us much.
Okay.
You can assume that it's the brain just trying to make you feel better.
Yeah.
I might even question that, like, what would be the evolutionary function of that if we're going to go down that road? Whereas you could also argue that it's just perceiving something that's actually real, and that's why it's reacting like that. Again, it boils down to the mind-body problem. If you think of the brain as the generator of consciousness, then it's going to be really hard to get your head around this stuff. If, on the other hand, you think of the brain as more like a receiver.
Yeah.
If you think of a TV, the television show I'm watching on Netflix, right, doesn't emerge from the TV.
Yeah.
It comes from the signal. The TV can be having all kinds of malfunctions, and I'll see that if the TV's not working right.
Yeah.
But that has nothing to do with the signal. So that's more how I think of it. That's my variation on William James's prism theory of consciousness.
Yeah, the brain is just this thing that is, keeping you alive and function and helping you function, and that the consciousness and these things that we see or hear or whatever is completely separate from that, and they're two different things interacting with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, that's fine, I guess. I thought we cracked the case. I thought they figured it all out. I thought one accidental recording of a guy's brain while he has a heart attack. They're like, nope, that's it. It's just a slideshow from your brain. You get a PowerPoint, and then it's lights out forever.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, that's probably
Maybe.
not it.
Maybe not. We'll
Maybe.
see.
That's the perfect way to end this episode. Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. Erik, thank you so much for doing this. This has been such a great conversation. It's so nice to meet you. It's so great to have you on the show. I'm really excited for people to listen to this. I'd love to have you come back sometime, and we'll do this again.
All right. Sounds good. We'll do it.
Awesome. Thanks, Erik.